Business and enterprise is quite simply and very bluntly in the business of taking risk. Every time that we open the doors, every time that we begin a day, every time that we begin a shift, there's risk involved. There's investment capital at stake, there's reputation on the line. Every activity that we do involves some degree of risk. By large part, most of our organizations have learned how to mitigate and live with those risks. And we as individual leaders have learned how to accept risks on a pretty regular, all the day, every day kind of manner. That explains our confidence and our boldness is because we're able to accept those risks. Now, when you talk about risk, it covers a wide variety of things. I mean, everything from loss of revenue to damage to assets, loss of reputation, loss of status, everything possible can be covered in that what's at risk kind of category. Now, I want you to think about risk in these terms. When you're assessing a course of action, I want you to consider three variables. L, which is the likelihood of a risk occurring. So that's going to be a number that's, a whole number, even, is the likelihood that it'll happen 1? Is it 2? Is it 3? That's the likelihood factor. The R in this equation is the actual dollar amount of exposure associated with that risk. Is it $100,000? Is it $100? Is it $5 million? And then finally, B. B represents the potential benefit associated with the risk. So let's look at this in a formula for a minute. L, the likelihood that risk will occur, times the risk exposure, R, is it greater than, less than, or equal to the benefit that you hope to achieve? So in that model, if the risk, the likelihood times the risk, is greater than the benefit, the answer here becomes really, really self-obvious. Don't do it. But on the other hand, in the more likely outcome, if the likelihood times the risk is less than the benefit, now we have some decisions and something to talk about. That doesn't mean it automatically say go for it, but at least it keeps the discussion alive on whether it's worth taking that level of risk. Now, I don't want anybody to be paralyzed in analysis or doing these kind of long calculations, but that's a very short-term version of how do I get to a point and be able to use some courage and make some decision and still manage the risk appropriately. Let's consider a really common example. If I buy out a long-term employee and it costs $20,000, the risk, if I make that offer and he or she accepts that or does not accept that, the risk is that person could sue for wrongful termination or wrongful constructive discharge. Potential lawsuit and legal costs could be $150,000, likelihood of occurrence, relatively low, a single event. Now, the benefit, if I calculate that right, by getting rid of this long-term employee and paying out some salary and hopefully avoiding some lawsuit, is I'm going to have some incredible increases in productivity. I'm going to free up some other money in other areas, and I'm also going to be able to recorrect some toxicity that exists in that working environment. So my benefit becomes $200,000-$300,000 over a 1-year period of time, while my risk factor is maybe about $150,000, $100,000. You know what? The risk then at this point becomes at least worth the dialogue of moving forward. If that was switched, if the risk factor was much higher than the benefit I would have gained, probably it tells me two things. First of all, I'm acting on emotion in terms of getting rid of that team member, followed by the risk exposure is way too high and I probably should take another course or think through another course of action in that regard. Again, L, the likelihood of occurrence, R, the actual dollar amount or cost of the risk, and B, the benefit involved, and you're comparing both sides of those to see if your application of courage is worth the risk.